A dado blade is a special type of blade that we can use to create dados or grooves, which is just a wide channel in a piece of material. It's a very effective way of making a wide cut like this, removing a lot of material. You often use a dado for something like a shelf, so it'll locate the shelf, and then it's also a fairly robust joint, so it supports a lot of weight. We also often use dados for something like the back panel of a cabinet, so this will slot in here just nicely. This wider groove was made with the dado blade, or the set of blades rather. This narrower groove here was cut with a standard table saw blade, a full kerf 1/8 inch wide blade with a flat top, not an alternating bevel. And you can see this slots in just as well. I'm pointing this out just to say that you have to use the dado blade as a set. So if you look here, you'll see this is actually two separate blades, and you can add more blades in the middle to make it wider. But the minimum is these two outer blades. You must use both of the outer blades that come together like this. You can't just use one blade by itself. So the blades are stacked off on the side like this. It's an uneven cut, so the blade isn't supported all the way across. You can't use one plate. You have to use two. It'll damage the dado set. So the minimum thickness is about whatever the width of the stack is, which is typically right around 0.2, maybe a little less, which works out pretty well for this thicker hardboard. And then you can stack the dado blade up wide enough to hold a 3/4 inch piece of stock. So this here is a 1/2 inch. I could have made it a 3/4 inch cut as well. It depends on the blades. Some blades might be different than others, but most of them go from just under 1/4 inch all the way up to just over 3/4 inch. It starts just under 1/4 inch, so you can add shims and get it perfectly at 1/4 if you needed. Dado blades can make a blind dado like this, so I can add this piece in here, and then you can see that on both of the ends it comes out flush and there is no sign of the dado. This isn't the best way to do it for production though. So for one-off pieces or prototyping, you can make a plunge cut, which isn't the safest, so for production you don't want to do that. You have to be a little careful with your setup. And I can make this blind dado. The issue is on the ends of this it's ramped because the blade is round. So you have to cut a matching feature in here, which again is not ideal for production because now we have to machine two different parts. But you can quickly prototype at least using a dado blade for a blind dado. You may end up having to use an end mill or something to make a dado in some cases, just to get that blind dado effect. Another issue with dado blades, another concern rather, is they're not great at holding heat. These are really thick blades, they're really heavy. They don't have any of the expansion joints or anything like a normal blade has. So you want to make sure these are clean before you do a production run, before you're using them to cut 30 or 40 parts back to back. So make sure the blades have been cleaned prior to a production run. I'm now going to install a dado blade. These tools here, the Allen key and the large wrench, come from the side of the machine underneath. The dado blade itself, some spacers, and the kicker blades are all located on the carrier on the side wall here with the other rip cut blades and cross cut blades. And then the throat plate for the dado blade and the brake cartridge come from the cabinet in the back of the room. The first thing I'm going to do is remove the throat plate, and then I'm going to remove the riving knife. In this case, we're not going to reinstall the riving knife, so I would put it on the side of the machine and leave it there. Every other instance in the class, you should have a riving knife in place. The riving knife is set up for a 10-inch cut. It's not meant for the 8-inch dado blade, so it's the only time we're not going to use it. You can have a riving knife installed when you're using it with fixtures and any other type of cut that you're making. Now that I have the throat plate and riving knife removed, I'm going to remove the blade using these wrenches. There's an open side and a closed side. The open side goes on the inside and then the closed side goes on the outside. It's best to drop the open side in first because it only indexes in 2 locations and it's hard to find those. So find that first and then drop the open side on the closed side. You can see that was fairly easy to break apart. When you're tightening it down, you don't have to put a lot of force. It's not going to improve the accuracy. So snug it up securely, but don't put a lot of force when you're tightening the nut on there. There will be a large nut and a washer. Sometimes the nuts wear out. Let the instructor know if this isn't fitting very well. There must always be a washer installed. Never use the table saw without a support washer on the side of the blade. Now that I have the blade off, I'm going to put the new brake on. In order to do this, there is a small red handle on the side of the cartridge. I'm just going to twist it up and pull it out. And then the blade sometimes can be kind of stuck. It helps you just kind of rock it left and right to pull it out. Now I have the cartridge out. I'm just going to slot the next cartridge on. Before I go any further, I'll make a quick note on accuracy. The table saw is going to reference, or the blade rather, is going to reference against the fixed washer on the left side of the machine from my point of view. So on this side of the machine, if I use the miter gauge, it'll always be accurate to the dado blade. When you're using a dado blade and you're varying the thickness of the blade, it's always going to vary this direction because this side is fixed against that plate. If I add spacers, it's going to affect the accuracy over here. So it's always best to reference your tooling from the left side from my point of view because this is a fixed plane, and then it's always going to change and vary off on this side of the machine. I have my blades. They come in pairs. It should say writing, or it should say this side out on the blade itself. And if you just make sure you have a set that's stacked together, and then they alternate inward with the teeth. So on this blade, the teeth are kicked in this way, and on this side, it's kicked in that way, so they overlap each other. Then you know you have a proper set. You can use spacers like these to make the blade wider in small increments, and then you can use a kicker like this to make the blade wider in larger chunks. So this will add about 1/8 of an inch or so to your cut, and then we have various spacers. We have a 60 thousandths, 20 thousandths, 12 thousandths, 4 thousandths, and I think there was another one. There's at least 5 different sizes that I found real fast. So make sure that when you're doing this, when you're keeping track of how many spacers you're using, you're aware that there's a 12 thousandth, a 20 thousandth, and a 4 thousandth, and they're all around the same thickness. When you put these spacers on, find a bad one. Hopefully you can see that. The hole on this has been worn out pretty badly. When you put the spacers on here, you want to kind of spin the spacer into place. So I'm going to put the spacer on, and then I'm going to spin the entire stack and bring it as far up onto this. You're going to kind of thread it on there, as far over as you can. Otherwise, you kind of damage these, and you again destroy the hole. It's also not very accurate. So if you're trying to make a repeatable setup, and you have the same set and you're putting the same set back on, if you're catching and destroying this, it's going to have minor differences in the thickness. You're not going to be able to tighten it as much. So make sure when you put multiple spacers on, especially when there's multiple, that you're putting the spacer on all the way up against the blade, flush as you can get it, and then kind of spin it to get it to walk all the way over against the blade as best you can. So in this case, I added 3 or 4 spacers on one side, and I'm just going to add this kicker, and just make sure all the teeth are pointing towards you. So the blades are all pointing towards me to make the cut properly. And then I'll put on these other 2 spacers. And then again, what I typically do right at the end, once I have all the spacers on, is I'm going to again twist the entire setup of the blade to pull everything as close over as I can before I put the nut and washer on. And there's definitely a lot of gaps in here. Sometimes you can feel it kind of tighten up. There we go. So now everything is kind of packed over already, and when I tighten the nut and washer on there, it's not going to be shearing off those little pieces of metal. It'll also tighten a lot easier, and it's a lot more consistent. I prefer to have the blades kind of alternating. I don't know if that matters in any way, but that's just something I have always done. I'll put the washer on, the nut. And again, I'm going to find, when you open in, find the 1 or 2 spots that it does go. I also always put the wrenches so they're pointing out from each other. You put them in this way. They'll be in your hand interference. So just push them where they're out and away from each other. And then again, just snug it up, and that's good enough. You don't need to bear down a lot on this. Now that the blade is on, I can use the little Allen key here to adjust the brake's position. It's written on the face of the brake itself as to how far the spacing should be. So there is a writing on the front. And I can use, it's got this little yellow flare on it to kind of remind you, there's a yellow nut right here I'm going to twist, and it's going to move the brake position. In this case, it probably doesn't need adjusted. Now that I got the blade in place, I'm just going to shut the little gate on the side for dust collection, lower that silver handle, and I'm going to put on a throat plate. And then I can raise and lower the blade as I need to make my cut. In most cases, if you use the same spacers, you'll get the same final blade width. But in cases like when you're using a box joint and you need those blades to be within a few thousandths of each other, even if you use the exact same spacers that you had the first time, it may not stack out the exact same. So just be aware of that. I'm not going to run through the entire process real quick, just as kind of a recap. So the first thing I'm going to do is make sure the machine is off on the side and make sure the main power is off. I'm then going to remove the throat plate and then remove the riving knife. We won't need this anymore. I'm going to use the wrenches here, remove the blade. I'm not going to put any spacers or anything on in this case. I'm just going to put this blade up on by itself. And I'm going to put the brake on before I put the blades on just because it's easier to do. So again, blade with no spacers. Make sure it's pointed in the correct orientation. The spacing looks about good, so I don't have to use the yellow wrench to adjust anything. And then I'm going to snug it down. And then I can set my blade height from here.